Well, I kind of think it might just be the three of us today. We'll see if anyone else joins. Okay. Okay, remind me, let's see, you came to the Excel sessions, is that right? And
Yeah.
you did also?
Yeah.
Okay, you guys both did. Okay, great.
Enjoying all the sessions.
I love it. Good. Okay. Well, this is going to be in some ways similar to the last session of Excel. So talking about how to take all the stuff that we did and put it together into visualizations. But it's also going to be sort of like a review, kind of putting together what we've covered in SQL and in Python. So to kind of give you an example of a workflow, pretty similar to what I might go through at my day job of like, what does it look like to do a project from start to finish using this tool, using some SQL, some Python, some built-in visualization. So yeah, this one will be probably even a little bit more like kind of project-based, kind of trying some stuff than the other ones. But I do have a little bit of stuff to go through at the beginning. I just realized the door is still open. I'm gonna shut it. So I don't know all these people outside. Someone is joining. Oh. Hi, welcome. Remind me, were you here for some of the previous sessions?
I honestly thought this was like a separate one.
Oh, got
I
it.
can sign up for it.
Okay,
And
cool.
then I know it's a section. I can just catch up. I mean, I saw that Digital Lab upload like the previous one online.
Yeah.
So I can catch up with that.
Cool. Okay, yeah, that's totally fine. Have you used SQL or Python before? Okay, cool. It's all good. We'll check in. First thing you want to do is go to this site. This is a tool that we're going to be using during the session to kind of walk through what we're doing. So you want to go there, sign up with either your USC email or like the Google Microsoft thing. And then once you're in there, you'll see a little prompt where you can join a few different like workspaces, and you'll want to choose the Android Digital Lounge one. It should be at the bottom of the list, I think. And let me know once you're in there and I'll show you how to copy the cool. Okay. Fantastic. All right. Great. Well, let me do a little bit of context. So I am here teaching SQL and Python, and today we'll also talk a little bit about visualization and kind of how all those pieces fit together. We're going to be using this tool called Hex, which is, I think, a really handy tool. It's the one I use at my day job, which is at a podcasting technology startup. And it's what I use to make all of our dashboards, do all of our analysis. And I think it's also a pretty good tool to use to learn because it saves you some of the setup. So once you're in there, you're going to want to hit the Hex icon at the top. So yeah, perfect. All right, cool. And then you should see, yeah, the very first one fall. And then if you do, you're all good. On the top, you do the little dot, yeah, hover over, is maybe this one. Yeah, this little arrow. There we go. And then duplicate. Perfect. And then you can, so this is your copy. You can type in there, run code, see how it all works. Well done. All right. So today what we're going to do is kind of put together some of the things we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks and talk about putting some visualization on top of that. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of what data visualization means, what a dashboard or report looks like, which are kind of two very common forms of visualization. We're going to talk about interactive components in Hex. So far we've been using Hex to write code, run code, just display the results of that code. Today we'll talk about how we can actually create tools that users can interact with. So things like changing filters or doing drop downs, stuff like that. That will all be very similar to like a Tableau or Salesforce or any other kind of like data visualization tool you might encounter. I guess I put this a little out of order, and we'll sort of, as we're doing that, we'll sort of talk about the process of putting together a data visualization, steps in that process where you might want to use SQL, you might want to use Python. There's definitely moments where you could use either, so you can kind of just pick the one that you're most comfortable with. We'll kind of walk through that. All right, so just a little bit of a reminder of how this works. So we can write a little bit of SQL and get some results. We can take those results and write some Python on those results. And then we can take those results and write some SQL on them again, right? So we can go back and forth between those tools as much as we want. Today, I've got some kind of templates laid out for you all of places where I suggest we try SQL, places where I suggest we try Python. If you like, you're more than welcome to sort of switch and you could do this whole exercise in either one. So kind of up to you, but just kind of a case to practice using both. And then, like I said, we'll also use some of the kind of built-in visualization tools, which we haven't really played with a ton yet. Okay, so just a little bit of like context on what a dashboard is. This might be a bit of a review if you were here for the Excel dashboarding session, but basically the concept of a dashboard is to help tell a story from the data. Right? So either with that story, you're either just trying to provide context for someone, you're maybe trying to prompt that person to take an action, or you might be trying to answer a specific question that they have or give them a tool to answer their own specific question. All right, so what sets dashboards apart from reports is that dashboards typically have some interactive components, which we're going to talk about today. That would be something like a drop-down menu where you could filter by time span or a certain category, anything like that. They can also get a lot more sophisticated with the types of inputs you can do, but that's the type of thing that we typically see in dashboards. You also notice dashboards typically have a mix of kind of larger scale charts that are rolling up information in a variety of shapes. They also have these kind of single value, I guess we can call them, components. So an individual percentage or an individual dollar amount. These are numbers that people want to like know quickly off the top of their head. So single value components we'll talk about today. And there's also often sort of like a data table or like a chart view included in a report, especially if it's sort of this first kind of provide people with details. So we'll work on all these different types of components today. But yeah, typically a report is more often kind of like a static object. You can create a report using all the same tools that you create to use a dashboard. You typically are just going to kind of like take a screenshot or save it as a PDF or kind of treat it as a snapshot in time. A lot of these tools, this one we're using today, also Power BI, Tableau, etc. They have tools where you can sort of like export a report easily. Also, the lines are getting like a little bit blurry. I have dashboards, for example, that are set to, do a scheduled run every Monday, where every Monday it just like takes a screenshot of itself and emails it out to the team as sort of a report function. So they can kind of be intertwined a little bit. Reports also often typically include a little bit more kind of like written context at the top. You might include a few sentences or a little more description explaining what all the charts are doing. I also think that's a pretty valuable thing to do for dashboards as well. And another reason I like Hex, because you can add cells of just text in between your kind of code and all that as well. All right, so just quickly thinking about some of those dashboard styles that I mentioned. So this is kind of how I think about dashboards and kind of a few different types that you can make. So a display dashboard is just going to focus on summarizing information for people. So this is more of the kind of like giving someone context. So I think of this as like when you're driving your car, right? You have this little display of how much gas you have, how fast you're going, temperature of your engine, etc. And those are just kind of pieces of information in a little dashboard view that you want everyone to have, so they have context for the kind of broader thing that's going on. Okay. Now the little center section of your car dashboard is, I think, the best example of an action dashboard. So normally these lights are blank, they're empty, they're like blend in with the background, unless something is wrong, right? Or different about the situation. So someone doesn't have their seatbelt on, your tire pressure is low. These lights are going to come up at that point. So this is a style of dashboard that often might show as 0 or green or kind of as empty when everything's going well. And then when some special situation is going on, you might have it display results like, uh-oh, it's going to filter for ones that are missing a key piece of information, for example. And then toolbox dashboards, this is kind of where I end up with a lot of hex dashboards I make if I'm making it really interactive. This is very similar to the homepage of any app you might be interacting with, Spotify or Airbnb or anything like that, right? This is a thing that's going to display to you some information in kind of a roll-up format, and it's going to give you a lot of kind of filters and views that you yourself can go modify, right? I can filter by genre, I can filter by artist, I can filter by what I last listened to. So those are kind of the styles of dashboards that are out there. We'll be kind of working on like a more of a display, maybe toolbox kind of style dashboard for this project. Okay. And you just always kind of want to be thinking about what questions you're trying to answer with the dashboard, what action you're trying to drive. And if you don't have a clear question or action, then you just want to be thinking about who's going to be looking at this and what kinds of decisions are they making? What are they going to be thinking about? Okay. All right, so I'm going to switch over and talk about the project that we're going to be working through today. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. We've looked at a few different data sources so far in this series. Today, we are going to be looking specifically at some data that I don't think we've looked at yet in this series. That's some marketing data. Okay, so it's going to be some data fictionalized, but sort of like realistic fictionalized, I would say, data about some different marketing campaigns that a major retailer is running. So thinking about our point of view for this dashboard. So we are, let's say, a marketing intern, we're working in the marketing department at this retailer. They're launching a new line of shoes. They want some kind of report or dashboard summarizing the performance of the marketing campaigns they've already done. And then they want some analysis to recommend sort of a strategy for their marketing budget moving forward. Okay, so your job is to kind of take these two data sources, think about this question, and we're going to kind of go through the process of creating that report. So what would we present back to the marketing director, right? How would we identify what marketing channels are performing really well from this data? How would we think about the ROI or the return on investment of our spend in each of these marketing channels? And then how would we communicate our results and our recommendation using visualizations? Okay, so that's kind of the context for what we're going to do today. Just a little bit of reminders about Hex. So typically we're going to be working in this mode, which is our notebook mode. Towards the end of our session, we'll jump over to app builder mode, which is what will let us kind of do a little bit more kind of visual layout with our charts and things. But for the kind of the first chunk of our session, while we're writing SQL and Python, we'll stick in this kind of notebook type of view. All right, so you'll see kind of some text I've written in here. And then you'll start to see some cells with code. Some of these are already written in. Some of these are going to be kind of partially written for you all to fill in during this session as kind of our exercise review practice. This one is pretty self-guided. So if you're feeling like you want to go a little faster than I'm talking, you can kind of read through and go at your own pace. But I am going to kind of walk us through how this is going to work. So our basic steps, kind of general process that we're going to do is first we're going to load our data. So we're going to run a few Python commands to load our data. I've already written those, and those are similar to what we've used in previous weeks. Then we're going to use SQL to model our data. Okay, this is where we're kind of going to be writing some of those SQL queries to do some kind of cleaning up of our data, get it into a format that's going to make it really easy for us to do our final analysis. We'll do some kind of cleanup and summarizing of our data. So we'll join some of our data frames together. We'll use Python to do some summarizing, add some additional columns, stuff like that. And then we'll use all of that information and start creating some visualizations. Okay, cool. We're going to load our data first. So this is a cell that I've already written. This is some Python that's importing a library of other functions that we're going to use. This is that read CSV function, which just allows me to upload a CSV or Excel file right here into my files section. I've already loaded these in here for you, but you can also upload your own files this way and kind of analyze data in here using text yourself if you like. So these files are already in here. All I'm going to do is run this cell. This is super important. You want to hit the pink run button in this cell that starts with import pandas. Once you do that, you'll see down below your little data frame names pop up. You should see one called ad spend data and one called performance data. All right, and I will know that worked if I go into my data browser, which is my option, my toolbar just below the magnifying glass. My data browser, I'm going to go to data frames, my first option, data frames. And then I'll see a few different data frames in here. Now I've already run this whole kind of sample project, so I've got a few additional, but you should see at least two. You should see one called ad spend data and one called performance data. All right. If you click on either of those, you'll see down below a little preview of which columns they have in them, how many total rows they have, etc. All right, so you'll notice that these data sets are a little smaller than the data sets we've worked with in previous weeks. This is 156 rows, this is 60 rows. So these are a little simpler. This is also a whole project you could probably do in Excel if you wanted to. And to that point, if you're getting stuck at any point, if you're more comfortable in Excel, you can download those files, you can mess around with it in Excel to get a sense of what you're trying to do, and then come back to our SQL or Python to kind of help yourself kind of troubleshoot or think through what you want to be doing. That's something I often do if I'm getting a little stuck with SQL. Yeah.
Is it easy to build a database using Hex?
You mean like look at the data itself?
And then like if I had a series of Excel or I want to put it like make it as a database,
Yep.
Is it easy to achieve it using Hex?
Yes, that's exactly what I've been doing each week for this class when I set it up. So all I do is you can start a new Hex project, come into files and just hit add. And yeah, you can upload any, I usually save it as CSV. I think you can technically do Excel as well, but the formatting is a little funky. You could just do a bunch of files, then you just do a couple lines of code like this. So pandas, you could just copy these, read CSV, and then after this, they're just all in there. Then you can interact with them with SQL, Python, just like any database. Next, good question. Okay, cool. So let's get a little warmed up with some SQL. So the first thing I always recommend that you do when you're starting with a new data frame in SQL is to just look at the first few rows, see how it looks, get a sense of what the columns are, what the values are, that kind of thing. All right, so the way that we create a SQL cell, in between any of your cells, you'll see this little plus sign. You want to click that, that'll give you a little add cell menu. We're going to be working with a few different types today, but this one, you can start with this one that says SQL query. All right, with SQL query, make sure in the upper right-hand corner it says data frames like this. If it does not say data frames, you can click on it and switch it to data frames. All right. And once it says data frames, we can write some simple SQL. So the way we write a SQL statement, I think I have a little summary just down below here, but any SQL statement is going to start with select. The simplest after select thing you can write is just star or asterisk. That's just going to select everything, all the columns, all the rows. Then we use the word from to tell it where we're going to take our data from. I can double check the name of my data frame in my data browser just here. So let's look at ad spend data, for example. I actually meant to be doing this in my demo docs. Let me switch over here. Okay, doing the same thing, just doing it on this document so that I don't ruin the template. Okay, select star from ad spend data. And then I typically will just do limit 10 to run a quick column or to run a quick check. In this case, since we know the data frame is very small, there'd be no harm in just selecting the whole thing. But I'll do that and then I'll hit this run button in the upper right hand corner, or you can hit Command Enter on your keyboard. All right, once you do that, you should see either a little preview like this with columns date, vendor, and amount, or you should see an error message. If you see an error message, give me a little wave and I will help you figure out what is going on. All right, but just kind of looking at the data, this is usually the best way to kind of wrap your mind around it. So we know from our context that this is marketing campaign data. So it looks like there's a variety of dates. Looks like these are mostly in 2023. We see Google ads, Facebook ads, influencer marketing. Okay, so it looks like there's a few different kind of marketing channels they're talking about here. And then spent amount. All right, these look like dollar amounts, a few $1,000s. That kind of makes sense for marketing campaign. All right, cool. So that's one of my data frames. The other data frame that I have is my performance data. So I'm going to write the very same query. So I'm going to add another cell to SQL and then look at the first 10 rows of my other data set the exact same way. So select star from performance data, and you can be doing this in your own copy of the doc as well. I'm going to do limit 10 to just grab my first 10 rows. I'm going to hit run and we will take a look at this. All right. So this one has a few more columns. I'm going to collapse this so we can see it a little bit larger. All right, so we have UTM medium, UTM source, and UTM campaign. All right, these are kind of marketing tags. This is how sort of online like lead generation, I guess, is attributed to a specific source. So sometimes when you click on a URL and you see that it's super long and it's got a bunch of stuff attached to it, those are often UTM tags telling the website where you got to their website from, right? Did you click on a Facebook ad? Did you click on an affiliate link? Something like that. All right, so I can see start to see a few different categories: social, PPC, which is pay per click, podcasts. Seeing within those a few different, Facebook, influencer, Google, and then I'm seeing campaign. It looks like these are a little bit more specific. Okay, so it looks like on Facebook, maybe they did a video, they did some kind of promo, some kind of giveaway. All right, so trying a few different types of things. And then I've got some result columns. So along with each of these campaigns, how many visits to their website did they get for each of these campaigns? All right, looks like some were maybe more successful than others. And then we've got total purchases. So these also look like dollar amounts. So this is how many or kind of what's the total dollar amount that the website attributes to traffic that came from one of these campaigns. All right, and then we've got a month. It looks like there's a row for maybe each month and each campaign, and how many website visits, et cetera, they got. All right, any questions about just like the data sources or sort of the prompt for what we're doing? Any questions about the kind of context of it? All right, great. Okay, so next up, we're gonna do some data modeling. All right, so I'm gonna kind of talk through what we're gonna do. Hi, welcome. All right, so what we're gonna do next is model some data. And we're going to start with SQL. So we'll kind of start with some SQL, we'll jump to some Python, and then we'll jump to some visualization, roughly is our plan. Have you been to one of our previous workshops?
No, this is our first one.
Okay, great. Just make sure you go to this site, get signed in, go to the Annenberg Digital Lounge.
Okay.
Please give me a little wave if you get stuck anywhere. All right. So we are going to write a few queries to kind of go through a few steps. All right, this is called data modeling. All right, so I'm going to talk through these first and then we'll work on each individual one. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to make a data frame called performance data 2. And the purpose of that is to add a column to our performance data frame. All right, now the reason that we're going to do this is eventually we want to be able to join these data sets together, right? We want to be able to say, all right, we have some information on how much we spent on the ads themselves. So that's our input. And then we have some information here on, for each of these campaigns, how many website visitors do we get? How many purchases were actually made on the retailer's site? All right, so we've got kind of our inputs and our outputs. We want to join these together. Now, part of the reason I do my kind of like little preview, just select a few rows from each data source, is because we want to get our heads around how are we going to join these two data frames together. So just looking at these briefly. Here it looks like in our vendor, we have Facebook, Google Influencer. And down here, if I'm looking at my columns, this UTM source column looks pretty similar to that, right? I see Facebook, I see Google Influencer, podcasts. So it looks like if I'm going to try to do some analysis of how much did we spend versus how much did we kind of get out of it, I'm going to want to be able to join on this information, right? I'm going to want to kind of join those two sources together. The thing is, up here, we have Facebook ads, capitalized, capital F, capital A, right? And then down here, we have all lowercase Facebook. And same with each of these, right? So I can see that this is like sort of the same, or this column is kind of like referring to the same information or the same piece of information. But in these two sources, it's like spelled a little differently. Super common issue to run into. If you have dates that are formatted differently, maybe you have last name in one thing and email in another thing, right? All sorts of things. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a column that sort of translates this column into this kind of format, if you will, right? So in order to join these together, we need an exact match. So what we're going to do is basically use SQL to add a column to this data frame, where for this row, it will say capital F Facebook ads, right? For this row, it'll say capital F Facebook ads. For this one, it'll say, let's see, capital I influencer marketing. All right, so we want to add that column so we have something to join on. All right, that's the first thing that we're going to do. Second thing that we're going to do is do some summarization. So we're going to figure out our total spend per vendor. Okay. We're going to summarize our performance information also by vendor. All right, so we're cleaning up the vendor name. We're summarizing our two data sources by the vendor, and then we're going to join those two data frames together. All right, so in our two data sets, we have a total of 4 different vendors. So essentially what we're going to do is make sure that they all have kind of the same titles for those vendors. Then we're going to summarize each data frame so that each data frame has 4 rows. Okay, 4 rows labeled the same, labeled with the same vendor names. And then on the last step, we're going to join those together so we can see the inputs and outputs per vendor all together for analysis. Okay. Any questions about generally what we're about to do? We get into it. Okay. Did you get into Hex? Okay. Okay. Sweet.
I already got a copy of what we have here.
Phenomenal. Okay. Cool. Great. All right. So what we're going to do next is work on, I have sort of a partial SQL query for you in the template for this one. All right. So just as a little refresher, we already created our performance data frame. So I've got sort of the beginnings of a query and I'm going to have you fill in the middle. Okay. So what we're doing is we're doing select star, meaning we're selecting everything that existed in this data frame. Then we're adding a comma and then we're adding an additional column. All right, so this is us adding an additional column. We're using a case statement, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, which is basically a sort of if-then type of logic, right? We can give it case when this column equals some value, then put this some new value in our new column. All right, so go look here based on what this is, put some other thing in there, put that as our new column, and then that whole thing is going to be, we write as vendor, as meaning we're going to give it the title vendor for our new column. And we can fill in a variety of cases. All right, so we need to write a few more lines in here because we have some additional sources. All right, so I have one example here, when UTM source equals Facebook, then Facebook ads. So to write that line, I went and looked at how the, did I run this in here, run this over here. I went and looked at how my source was spelled in this data frame. And then I went and looked at how my source was spelled in this data frame. All right. And I wrote my case statement to say, all right, if it's spelled this one way, make it match the spelling of the other one. All right, so what I want to do now is add a couple more lines to this query. So you can do this along in your own copy. So I basically want to add a few more of these when, then things, okay? You go, if you have a sense of how to do this, go ahead. when you get it working, you should be able to run it and you'll see our column fill in. So you'll see here when I've just got this one, when source is Facebook, then put in Facebook ads. It's doing that for our first 4 rows, right? Where our source happens to be Facebook. But then after that, my vendor column is just saying none. It's empty because it's got a different UTM source, which I don't have a case for. So let me go to my next one here. So UTM source, next one is influencer. All right, so I'm going to add another when statement, UTM source equals. It's a string, so I'm going to put it in quotes. So I'm going to tell SQL that it's a string. It's influencer. All right, and so that's my if. Then I'm going to do my then part of the logic, my when and then. So what value do I want to have this column give me when it's influencer in this column? Influencer marketing, correct. I want to do that because that's how it appears in my other data frame that I eventually want to join to, right? So I'm going to, in fact, I'm just going to copy paste this to make sure I get the spelling exactly right. Okay. Great. And make sure it's in my quotes, my single quotes. All right, so once I add that line, I can hit run in the upper corner of my cell here. And then I can look at my updated results. All right, so now if I look at my vendor column, this row said none here before, and now it says influencer marketing. Pretty cool. All right, so now I need 2 more of those for my additional 2 UTM sources. All right, so go ahead and fill in 2 more when thens for your other 2 sources so we can get it to match.
Question, like, when do we add comma?
Good question. So commas are added between, basically like between when you're referring to columns. So if you want to select like columns 3, 7, and 10, you would do column 3, comma, column 7, comma 10. And same thing if you're going to group by multiple columns, you would need to put commas in the group kind of part of it. Yeah, basically just between columns. Yeah. All right, I'll give you a second to fill out the rest of your case statement. Your ears working all right?
Yeah, it's working, but just wondering, how do I get a preview of all the data frames?
Perfect. Yes. So you want to go up a little bit and we'll run our first cell here. So
The
yes.
Panda,
Yes.
library.
You already ran this?
Yeah, I just ran.
Okay,
this.
perfect. So go ahead and click data frames here.
Oh.
Oh, sweet. Okay, cool. Yep. So then you can click on any one of these. So ad spend and performance are the 2 we're going to work with.
Yes,
And then it'll give you our columns. Yep. And then to do a little preview, I just write a simple SQL query. Let me show you what that looks like.
like showing the head of the
Yeah.
few rows.
Yeah, exactly. So you can do it with Python if you know how to do that. You could do just the data frame name dot head, or you can do a simple SQL query, which looks like this in a SQL cell. Select star from data frame.
So just showing the top 10 rows.
Yeah, that's typically what I do. Yeah, top 10 or top 20, whatever you want to look at. So far? All right, who's got their case statement sorted out? You got it? All right, what you got?
I got like it's Google, then Google Ads,
Okay,
broadcasts, and like the capital P broadcast. and
excellent.
Influencer as influencer marketing.
Fantastic. Okay, cool. So you got something that looks like this. Maybe you got the order different. That's totally fine. Perfect. And once I do this query, I can run it. All right. And then I can just double check that my vendor column is all filled in. I think the goal is to not have my vendor column be blank. If I had made a typo, let's say, for example, I had written LODcasts instead, then I would see that my vendor would come up blank for these because it's not finding anything that exactly matches that string. All right, so I always want to check that, make sure that that's working. All right. It's my little case statement. All right. Cool. All right, so next thing that we're gonna do, this is a query that I already wrote for you. This is kind of a simple one. What this query is gonna do is it's gonna look at our ad spend data frame and it's gonna do some grouping. All right, so it's basically I wanted to add up for all of our vendors, how much money in total have we spent on marketing with each of these vendors or these channels, okay? So I wrote a pretty simple SQL query here. I'm doing select vendor, which is the column I wanna group by. I'm doing sum, so just a simple function of the spent amount column, which I can see in my data browser. It's my spent amount column. All right, and then I'm just going to relabel it as spent amount, label it as the same thing from ad spend data, and then group by one. Group by one just meaning I want to group by the first column that I have. I could easily have also written group by vendor here. Same thing. That'll run this exact same way. All right, so you can either refer to columns as which number column it is or by its name. All right. Once I do that, run that query, I should see my little pop-up here, and I should see 4 lines, right? I should see my Google ads, Facebook ads, influencer marketing, and podcasts. All right, so just to kind of check back in on where we're at with our little workflow here. So we did sort of some data cleanup where we used our case statement to add a column to that performance data frame. All right, the other thing we're gonna wanna do is go back and name that data frame. All right, so just to go back here, once you do your case statement down at the bottom, it probably auto named it like data frame or data frame 2 or something. You can double click on this and rename it something else. So I usually just try to give it a descriptive name. So since this is a, you can call it like performance data updated or something like that, just hit enter. And that'll update it, and then that's how it'll appear in your data browser here and in any of your other queries. You can now refer to this result the same way that you would the initial ones that we started with. Okay. You can give it whatever name. All right, just make sure you know what it is. All right. So coming back to this, so we did this, we've got our new data frame. We've got our little example of how to add up our total spend, right? That's a SQL query that I just showed you. You should have a copy of that in your copy as well, right? And then we've got one more. Oh, I don't know if that one for you guys to write. I guess I did not. Okay. I did one more query here, which is doing a very similar thing to this query, but I'm summarizing my new data frame. All right, so in this query, I'm doing select vendor, I'm doing some summary functions, and then I'm just doing the select from my new data frame that I made before. The reason that I want to do that is my original performance data frame doesn't have my vendor column, right? I only added that later in performance data 2. If I look at performance data 2, that one has my vendor column. All right, so here I just did a very similar thing. All right, we did sum of website visits as, again, just giving it the same name, total website visits. Same thing for my purchases column. All right, and then I did our count function, just as a little refresher. Count is doing the same thing as sum. It's just grabbing the count instead. I put in this distinct here. This is going to just count anything that's unique. So if the same campaign, for example, is repeated multiple times in my data set, this will just count it once, right? This is the thing you might want to do if you're counting, say, email addresses. If someone maybe double registered for your event, you might want to do count distinct. So you're getting a just actual number of how many unique people you're getting. Okay, and the same thing here, group by one, or you could have group by vendor. When you run this cell, so I ran this before I had finished my other case statement, right? So before I had all my vendors filled in, I think I finished it on this one. So because that case statement was finished, now when I run this, I get my nice 4 vendor rows. I get my summary of website visits and purchases, and I get my number of campaigns. Right? So I have now, and then the other thing I would want to do with these 2 that I did, I think this will save in your copy. I just went ahead and renamed them so I know how I can refer back to them later. It gets really hard when everything is data frame 7, 8, 9. It's hard to remember what everything is. So I named this one total spend because this is my spend by vendor. And I named this one performance summary because this is kind of summarizing the results by each of these vendors. Okay. So I've got my 2 data sources sort of condensed, cleaned up, summarized so that they each have 4 rows, and these 4 rows have matching values, right? They're in a different order, but they're 4 of the same. This is a small data set, so what I could easily do is just copy paste these 2 things into Excel and put the Facebook stuff in the Facebook row and the Google stuff in the Google row, and then I could go do that manually. In this case, because it's small. But we're going to use SQL to do that same thing, that same step that we would otherwise do. Okay. All right. Great. So this is where I have a little template for you. All right. So what we're going to do here is join our performance summary data frame onto our total spend data frame. All right. So these are the 2 little summaries that I just talked through. All right, so I've started your query for you. I've given select star from total spend. You're gonna want to add a join. I've got a little, some little refresher notes up here on how to add your join. So it's always gonna come after your from. Okay. And you're gonna want to join your other data frame using the column that they share in. So your query will look at the column or columns that you put after the using part of your query to join your data frame. So for example, if you had a data set that had a first name and last name column and another data set that had a first name, last name column, you might join data frame using, then in parentheses, first name, comma, last name. Would be one way you could use multiple columns. Join. But here we just need 1 column, right? These 2 data sets that we just summarized together only have 1 column in common, and that is vendor. Add a line to our query that's going to join on our vendor column.
Yeah, every time I tap join, it all shows. Right.
It does it. So it usually like highlights the keywords a little bit. So for example, if I come in, or is anyone done with their join? Does anyone have their join together? All right. Cool. All right. So just to show you what our join will look like. So I'm just adding a line to my same query. All right, so this is what I had before, select star from total spend, left join. You could here also just do regular join. For most use cases, these are the same. Most beginner use cases, these are the same. Name of our other data frame that we're joining. Okay, performance summary. Then I'm going to pull in my other keyword using and then give it whichever column or columns I want it to use to join them together. Right? In this case, it's just that one column vendor. The question was, why are these highlighted in gray? It usually just highlights the keywords in whatever, whether you're writing in Python or SQL, it'll kind of highlight your like key syntax words. I don't know why that one's not blue, like selected from. But it's just to tell you basically like you wouldn't want to name a column like join or select because that would like cause issues. That's just going to kind of give you that like visual hint. All right, so when you have your join and when you hit run in the upper right-hand corner, you should get something that looks like this. All right, so this looks exactly like our performance summary up above, but it has one additional column, which is our spent amount. That's the one column that our other little data frame, our total spend had, right? It just had these two columns. Because we're joining on the vendor column, it's not going to repeat, like I'm not going to have my vendor column twice. All right, but it's got all the different columns from those two data frames combined, and we can check visually. All right, our Google ads, it looks like we spent about 64,000 and got about 9,000 website visits. I can come up here and check, okay, yep, Google 64, Google website visits about 9,000. All right, I can like check that my join worked as expected, all right? All those sorts of little checks you want to kind of be doing throughout the process. Okay. All right. Any questions about this kind of data modeling step? Anyone hit any error messages? Okay, cool. All right. So next we're going to do a little analysis. This is another example of something that you can do either in SQL or Python. But we're basically going to be looking at a common marketing metric or a simplified version of a common marketing metric, which is cost per visit or CPV as we're going to abbreviate it here. All right, so the way that we're going to calculate CPV or cost per visit is our total spend divided by our total visits, right? Some pretty simple math here, with the idea being we got different numbers of visits in our four different kind of marketing channels. And we want to get a sense of how, you know, if we spent more money or less money, we got more visits, less visits, how does that kind of shake out? What's our cost to get someone on the website in each of these channels? All right, so you can do this in either SQL or Python. So this last query that we ran, if it's not already named something like join, or joined, I advise that you name it something like that. All right. And then you can either add a SQL cell or a Python cell to add a column to this data frame. All right. If you're going to do it in SQL, it's going to look very similar to the sort of cases where we've added columns before, right? I did select star comma, and then I've done some other function to add a new column to my data set. All right. I can walk through a Python example as well. All right, but you basically want to add a column to this little joined data frame that says CPV that calculates this calculation, total spend divided by total visits for each of our vendors. All right, you could also try doing it once in Python and once in SQL just for fun, if you like. But this is exactly, if you are familiar with Excel, for example, right, if you had this data set in Excel, you could just start a new kind of formula column on that side. You would do equals, let's see, equals my total cost. So equals this column and then slash divided by this column, and that would be my little formula, right? So we're doing the same thing here in either SQL or Python. All right, so I'll give you a second to try that and then I'll walk through how to do it. All right. Anyone have a CPV column or any errors trying to add a CPV column? A little refresher, if you're trying to add a column in Python, it's going to look something like this. All right, you're going to give the name of your new column in your square brackets, all right, as our Python syntax. So square brackets, I can give my column a new name, do my equal sign just like I would do in Excel, and then I can give it whatever kind of formula operation that I want it to do. So this is an example from this workshop a couple weeks ago, but same idea, right? This is just a simple addition, but you could do whatever math or formula you want. So this is an example. You could write something very similar to this in Python to get that CPV column in there. All right. Okay, do people try this in SQL or Python? 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 SQL? Okay, cool. We'll talk about both. All right. So here is my little demo of how to add it in Python, all right, which is one way that we can do this. So joined is the name of my data frame just because that's what I named it here. All right, so you can just double click this little green thing and change the auto name to whatever. I changed it to joined. All right, and then to create a new column, all I do is I tell it the name of my new column that I want in my square brackets and my quotes. All right. So I give it a new column name. In this case, I'm just going to name it CPV. And your column name just generally, as practice, shouldn't have any spaces. So I could have also named it like cost underscore per underscore visit, something like that. Right, and then equals, and then I'm just doing kind of a simple math operation on my two columns. All right, so the column that has my dollar amount spent, my spent amount, and then I've just got a slash division divided by the column that has my number of visits. All right, and then I just typed the name of my data frame again so that I can get a little preview of it to show up here in Hex. All right, so when I do that, I can see my CPV for Google is coming out to about $7. So that means for every $7-ish that I'm spending, I'm getting about one website visit. It looks like for my Facebook ads, I'm spending about $3.50 to get a visit to the website, et cetera. So you can see kind of some of the different little ratio coming out here. All right, let's talk about how to do this in SQL. So let me pop open a SQL file. Very similar, I would do select from joined. This is usually how I set up my queries, come back to my select. All right, I would usually do select star. So I just want to add a column to all of the existing ones. I would check my column names in my little data browser over here on the left, which I can just get to from this guy below my magnifying glass. And I would come in here and I would say, all right, I want to look at my spent amount. Same thing, just slash divided by website visits. All right, and then I'm going to do as to give this column a name. So I'm going to call this CPV SQL. Okay, just to differentiate it since I already added a column to this data frame. All right, so I can check how my CPV SQL thing looks here. Looks good. Ignore these columns, these are the ones we're about to write next. All right, but if I look at my original CPV, which is here, and then I look at the CPV that I calculated in SQL, those numbers should match exactly because it's doing the same math. Yeah.
How do I format the code block to SQL? Because right now it's seeing, it seems like it's showing it under Python.
Yes, perfect. So you can add a cell in between any of your other cells, and then you
Uh-huh.
can pick
Oh, there, I
SQL
can
or
pick-
Python there.
gotcha.
Yep. Good question. All right, any questions, errors with this part? Getting our CPV.
Is that a reason that I can't just use CPV, but I have to do CPV SQL?
Oh, I just did that because I had already in Python, I had already created a column called CPV, so I just wanted to be able to demonstrate the difference. You could have done it either way. Yeah. And I think actually if I just name this one CPV, and I think what it's gonna do is it might just kind of label it as yeah. So I think if I label this one as CPV, it just overwrites the other one that I had. So I was just doing this as kind of a demo. Cool. All right. Great. Okay, we're next gonna do a very similar thing. All right, so we're gonna next do another kind of marketing metric. Copy of this. It's here. All right, which is ROAS, return on ad spend. All right, so this is, if you're thinking about this from the retailer's point of view, this is saying, all right, the total number of purchases from the people who came to the website from this ad campaign, how much merchandise did they purchase compared to what I spent on ads. If I spent $10,000 on ads and I got one $5 purchase, that's not a great return on my ad spend. Okay, if I spent $10,000 on ads and I got $20,000 in purchases, that's starting to look better. All right, that's kind of the type of thing a marketer might be looking at with this kind of metric. Okay, so here was our little CPV example, which you can fill in or just do in a new cell if you want. We're going to do the same thing with our ROAS. All right, so it's going to be very similar, slightly different metric. All right, we just want total purchases divided by total ad spend to add our ROAS column to our joined data frame. All right, so you can do it in Python just here, or you can add a different cell and do it in SQL if you'd rather. All right, so give that a whirl. In these cells, I have a few places with my little pound sign and then some notes. Those are just comments in my code. I can type anything in there, and anything after the pound sign is not going to run. It's just kind of like a note to self, or in this case, a note to you guys. So go ahead and add a column for your ROAS, fill that in. See if you can get that working. If you did the last one in Python, maybe try doing this one in SQL or vice versa. All right. So I'm going to add a ROAS column to my joined data frame. It might look very similar if I do it in Python. You can compare these two. This is the exact same line of code, just looking at different columns, all right, because it's a slightly different metric. So I'm just doing my joined, giving my column my new name, ROAS in my brackets and my quotes. And then I'm just doing my simple division of those two columns, right? My total purchases, meaning purchases made on the retailer's website, and then spent amount, meaning the amount I spent with the advertising vendor to run my advertising campaigns. All right. Any errors, any questions with this one? All right, so if I come and look at my ROAS, right, because I want my total purchases to be high in comparison to the amount that I spent, right? At least as big, if not bigger, right? So I ideally want this number to be at least 1, preferably a lot higher than 1, right? That's a good ROAS. So in this case, if I look at my ROAS results, it looks like I'm in the like 1 to 2 range on all of these vendors. All right, so I'm not completely underwater, but a couple of them are looking better than others at the vendor level. All right. Okay. Great. So what we're gonna do next is run through a very similar thing. We have some idea of what channels are most successful, right? If we look at our results so far, we're seeing a higher ROAS with Facebook ads and podcasts. We're seeing a lower CPV with those 2 channels, right? That makes sense because the math is kind of related, right? Just kind of different ways to look at it. So I have some sense that those channels might be better. This whole project is to make some recommendations to my marketing director about where I think they should allocate the marketing budget next year. These 2 channels are looking promising, right? That's probably what I would want to communicate in my final visualization that I'm making in this dashboard. That's the kind of thing you want to be thinking about as we go through, okay? But that said, I already, I had a bunch of data at the campaign level. So if I come back up to my original data sources, right, I've condensed this data quite a bit. I've condensed it down to these 4 sources, but I have a bunch of campaigns within each of these sources. I could imagine my marketing director following up and saying, all right, let's say we're going to spend all of our marketing dollars on Facebook ads. Which campaigns? We ran 4 different Facebook campaigns. Which one should I put my budget into? Which one of these campaigns performed the best? So that's something that I would want to be able to answer for her. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a very similar set of steps to what we just did. We're going to calculate the CPV and the ROAS again, but this time we're going to do it by campaign instead of just by vendor. All right, and this is going to introduce a different data problem for us to solve, okay? The problem is we don't have spend information by campaign. So if we go and look at our original spend data that we got here, this is all the data that we have on ad spend. We don't have spend by campaign for some reason. Maybe that's how the report exports from something. Maybe that's because it's not available. Whatever the reason is, we don't exactly have data on the campaign level in our spend data source. Okay, so we tried to ask for this data, we can't get it. So we got to figure out what to do. How do we answer this question at the campaign level using the data that we have? All right. So we get this sort of nugget of information that we can basically it's safe to assume that the spend was split evenly between campaigns. Okay, meaning basically what we need to do is find the total that was billed to each vendor, divide it by the number of campaigns that that vendor ran, and we'll consider that to be the cost of that campaign, right? So then the reason we need the cost of the campaign is so that we can get these 2 metrics, our CPV and our ROAS, at the campaign level. Okay, does that make sense? This is a type of problem you might run into doing this sort of analysis. Okay, so to answer that question, what we need to do is create a new data model called campaigns, which should have 1 row for each of our UTM campaigns and has some additional columns, all right, for the vendor, the spent amount, the total purchases, and the total clicks. All right. So since we want our data model to be at the campaign level and only one of our data sources is at the campaign level, we're going to start with that data source as our sort of basis. All right, so our performance data is the only one that's at campaign level. So that's what mentally where we sort of want to end up. All right, but we know we need to do this intermediate step where we need to go grab kind of basically average out our total spend with each vendor per campaign to kind of get a per campaign amount. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we need to figure out our per campaign spend. All right, meaning we already have from our previous little data frame, each vendor and the total that we spent. We need to figure out what is the average, basically average per campaign that we spent with these folks. So if we did 2 Google Ads campaigns, we should divide this spent amount by 2, and that would be our per campaign spent. All right.
You mean per campaign spend multiples? Which one?
So we would, that's the new column that we want to add. These are just ones, because this is a little template version. All right, but basically we want for each campaign, essentially we want to divide the total amount spent by the number of different campaigns that we ran with that vendor. So as a hint, if you're feeling stuck, our joined data frame has our total spent amount, which is half of the formula that we need. We also need our joined data frame to have a number of campaigns. All right.
I'm a little lost in how we calculate the campaign. Because we show the campaign by the name of the vendor.
Yeah, it's a good question. So here's a question. Have we already today counted up our campaigns in any way? Do any of the data frames you've made so far have a campaign count?
Yeah, usually, yeah.
Yes, very good. So previously we did a query where we did when we did our joined data frame, let me come back up to this. Back when we did this query. It's back in here. This query. Please. This one, okay. Right, so previously this query, which is already in here, right, is already summarizing by vendor, by website visits, by total purchases, and by number of campaigns. Right, so we have number of campaigns back in our old performance summary data frame that we made earlier. All right.
So, like, for example, Facebook ads have 4 campaigns.
Mhm.
And then I will link it to link it to spend amount.
Yep, and where did we already do that? Step.
Yeah, already.
Yep, we already did that.
So just make.
So we don't need to make it again because we already have it, right? So we just need to figure out for each vendor, what is their per campaign spent, meaning what is their spent amount divided by their number of campaigns. So you can use SQL or Python to add that as a column. Does that help? Sweet. All right. So you could do this in either SQL or Python, but you should have something that looks kind of like this. All right, so if I did it in Python, I would create a new column. I'm going to call it something like per campaign spend. You always want to do a descriptive title. Okay. And then I'm going to do very similar. I'm going to do equals joined, grab my spent amount column and divide it by my num campaigns column. All right. And then if I look at my joined data frame after I run that, I should have something like this. All right. And just to gut check it, my Google ads was about $60,000 and I ran about 3 campaigns. So it looks like each campaign was about $20,000. Right now, I know in the real world, if I were spending money with Google, I might have spent a different amount of money on each campaign, right? But for some reason, I don't have that in my data source. So I made what seems like a reasonable assumption, which is to just sort of assume that the spend was the same across the 3. That's the type of thing that you might want to include in any final report with this analysis, because that's where you made a little bit of a logical, right? If somebody reads this report and says, oh, I actually have a way that you could get your per campaign real spend, you could come in and substitute that back in. But until we have that, we're doing it this way. Okay. Cool. All right. So once I have my per campaign spend, now I want to do my kind of new data model. All right. So the reason we did all that to get my per campaign spend is to create a new data model called campaigns, which has 1 row for each campaign and will tell me what vendor was that campaign run at, how much was spent on this particular campaign, right? So that's what we're going to use our new column for. Total purchases driven by that campaign and total clicks driven by that campaign. Okay. So in order to do that, I've gotten us started, all right, with a little query, a little SQL query. I could have done this in Python as well. Again, just kind of demonstrating that we can switch back and forth. I've gotten us started with a little query here. So what I'm doing here is I'm grabbing my campaigns from my performance data 2. This is this data frame that we made earlier where we added our cleaned up vendor column, right? So I'm grabbing my campaign, my vendor, and then I'm doing some summarizing. All right, I'm summing up the total website visits, I'm summing up the total purchases, and then I'm grouping by 2 columns because I'm grouping by both my campaign and my vendor. Now I know either just logically or we could look at the data and figure this out. The campaign name is not repeated at multiple vendors, meaning that grouping by these 2 rows will still only give me 1 row per campaign. Right, if I had the same campaign name running on Facebook and Google, then I would get 2 rows here because I'm grouping by these 2 columns. But because the campaign name is specific to the vendor in my data source, though I'm grouping by 2 columns, I'm still only going to get 1 row per campaign. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So what we want to do next is join our data sources together. And this is a little funky because we're joining data that we've already previously joined. But this is a really common thing that you end up doing in various kinds of analysis. So I want you to know that sort of you can do it and what it looks like. All right. So here's what this looks like. So we have our campaigns data frame. I went ahead and renamed this campaigns. You typically want to name your data frame like what's the individual like unit or entity in each row. In that case, it's campaign, so that's what I named it. All right. I'm going to join onto my campaigns data frame because this has everything I need to do my per campaign analysis except for the spend, right? I don't know how much was spent on each of these campaigns. Now I could go look and say, all right, this launch video campaign was done on Facebook ads. So I could come up to Facebook ads and I could say, all right, our per campaign spend on Facebook ads from this thing we just did is $9,500. So I can come back here and put that in our, add a column here, type in $9,500. Okay, influencer marketing, go look over there, put it in. Right. That's exactly the case where I would want to join. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to join or left join would work here. My per campaign spend from my previous data frame, which I also named joined, right? So this data frame that I made, where I did my per campaign spend calculation, which is here, All right, we can think of this as sort of a little reference table, so a little kind of like reference information about each vendor that I'm then joining back on to the more detailed table that has a bunch of rows for each vendor because it has a row for each campaign, right? So I'm doing my left join vendor per campaign from joined, and in this case, I'm joining using the vendor column. All right, this is something that I'm going to do when, for example, this data frame has a bunch of rows, I think it's 156, and I'm joining onto it my data frame with only 4 rows. But it's going to make a copy every single time, and that's why I'm using my left join. All right, meaning left join is going to keep all of my rows from my first data set, or the one that's conceptually on the left. It's going to go down each of those rows, look at the vendor column, and say over here in my little 4-row table that I'm joining on, is there a match? Yes, great, we'll put it there. Next row, is there a match in these 4? Yes, we'll put it there. And it'll kind of repeat going down. All right. If there's not a value in my little 4 table that matches my longer table, it'll just leave that blank and keep going. All right. So typically when you're joining, you're using is going to be like a unique identifier. It's going to be like an ID number or an email address because you commonly want this like one-to-one join. But there are cases where you're trying to join basically a more general piece of information onto a more detailed data set, like in this case, right, where a per campaign spend is kind of information at the vendor level, but we want to join it back onto this. So that's why I'm using vendor as my joining column here. Okay. All right, so well, all I'm doing after that, I named this campaigns 2, is I'm doing these same formulas that we wrote before. All right, so CPV, it's my same per campaign spend divided by website visits. And then my ROAS is total purchases divided by my per campaign spend. So I'm using that new column that we just went to all that work of tacking on to our data model to calculate those same metrics that we calculated before. But now I have them at a campaign level and not just a vendor level. So I have a little bit more detailed information. All right, so if I come down here, I can start to see, all right, so even within Facebook, some of these had a slightly higher or lower CPV, higher or lower ROAS than the others. All right, for example, this launch giveaway had a pretty high cost per visitor, all right, and then a pretty low return on ad spend. That's below 1, meaning however much money I spent on that campaign, I got fewer purchases back. So that's, even if we want to move more budget into our Facebook campaigns, we might not want to necessarily move it into that specific campaign. Right? Okay, so all of that said, the reason that we did all of this is so that we can start to play with some visualization tools. All right. So where we've been adding cells in Hex, so in between any of your cells where you've been adding and you've been either grabbing the SQL or the Python, we have a bunch more options here under more. When you come under more, of course I can't click and look at the same time. Did you pause? Back here. Okay. I'll click on something in Zoom instead of. Okay, let me put this. Okay, so sorry about that. So when you're adding a cell, you come over into your more menu and you have a few different options for visualizations. All right, in particular, today we're going to look at chart. All right, so what we're going to do is you're going to add a chart cell. Anytime you add a chart cell, you can point it at any of the data frames that you've already created. So you're essentially going to say, I want to make a chart, and it's going to say of what data, and you're going to tell it whichever data frame. So the reason that we did all this data modeling is so that when I give it this data frame, it's going to be already have all the columns that I would want to display in my chart. All right, so I'll let you kind of play around with this a little later, but here's the first chart that I recommend that you make. Let's do a stacked bar chart. Go ahead and add a chart cell. Do a stacked bar chart. We want our axis, our y-axis to be our each campaign. And then we want our x-axis to be CPV, all right? Meaning we want to look at each campaign and try to figure out which campaign has the lowest CPV or the lowest cost to get a visitor onto our website, right? Once you do that, we want to sort it, right? Because we want our lowest CPV at the top, meaning we want to kind of put in priority order. What is our best CPVs? And then because we've done all our data modeling, for example, by adding our vendor column, we can do things like add color coding by our vendor. So I can have them all sorted out and I can say, all right, you know, color them so that the Facebook, they're all the same color and the podcast ones are all the same color, et cetera. And that'll give me a quick visual of, all right, they're ordered in order of lowest CPV to highest. So those lowest CPV are the ones I'm interested in, and are those all the same color or not? Gives me a quick visual cue of, are these all coming from the same vendor or the same couple of vendors? All right, so I'll give you a moment to play around with that. Hex also has some good built-in styling options, similar to what you find in a Tableau, Power BI, even Excel. So you can add data labels, which I always recommend doing as a best practice. Anytime you're working with dollars, you want to try to always format it as a currency or any currency to that point. You always want to format it as a currency so people have that visual cue. You definitely want to make sure that you have good titles on your axes that are clear. So if the auto-generated one isn't super clear, you can usually edit. And same thing for adding a title to your chart. All right. So go ahead and play around with that. You should come out with a visualization that looks something like this. Okay, so these are the names of my campaigns specifically. They're ordered by my CPV. I've added my little labels so I can in fact see what the CPM is or the CPV is. And then I've added a little color code, and because I did that, it put in a little legend for me of which color is which. I made Facebook blue, which is kind of nice because that goes together, but that was just auto-generated. I did not set that.
You present the dots, not change the.
Yes, so that'll come under your style portion. You'll have a few more options in here. So data labels, I always recommend turning on. Let's see. Yeah, colors are here. Would you ask about one more thing?
The
Axes, yes. I think these, can you just edit these here? Or do you have to go in here somewhere?
I change those into dots.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, it's under the style, the title. You can edit the titles here of the axis. Yeah. All right, anyone having any errors? Everyone getting a similar chart situation? Yeah.
Just a quick question for
Yeah.
the axis. If we choose to use aggregate none, how will it be different from choosing it the sum?
Oh, good question. So in this case, they should be the same
Yeah,
because
it
in
looks
our
like the
data
same.
model, we already did the sum.
Yeah.
If we hadn't done that in our data modeling step, which we did because we wanted to add some additional analysis, but if we were just doing a simple chart of sum, we could have just skipped that in the data modeling and just done it here.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. Alright. Cool. So yeah, so a bunch of little style notes. Some of this is personal preference. There's lots of good blogs and stuff on data visualization, but in general, I recommend being really clear with your labels. Doing an intentional kind of sort and color coding is always a really good idea. And then just making sure you get if you've got currency or any other kind of like scientific data, you got degrees or measurements or something like that, you always want to have your units on there so people know what you're looking at. Okay. All right, thinking back to our kind of dashboard concept from beginning of class, right? You commonly have single values on your dashboard. So we just did sort of a chart component, which is kind of similar to one of these, but it's common that you would also want to have kind of a single value of some kind, or maybe a total, an average, something like that. So we're going to add that. Hex has a feature for that as well. We're going to add a single value component to our dashboard that's going to show the average CPV across all of our campaigns. All right, we might want that because throughout our whole marketing strategy, we want to bring down our CPV overall. And one way we're going to do that is by funneling more budget into our lower campaigns. All right. So to do that, we are going to add a new component to our dashboard. So if you come into our add cell and then you go to the more, you'll see we have a special option for this, a single value component as a given option. All right, so we're going to add one of those in with a single value. So in order to do that, we're going to need one more cell before we do that, which is, I would recommend doing in Python to get our average CPV from our data table. So get our kind of data table down to a single value, and then we'll feed it into that component the same way that we fed our larger data frame into our chart component that we just did. All right, so what I would recommend that you do is create a Python cell and use our .mean function, mean meaning average here, to get the average of our CPV column. All right, and then you want to save that value to a variable. Quick refresher on Python variables. I put that in here. Would look like this without our little, without our brackets. All right, just give your variable a name and save your kind of .mean value to that name. All right. So you'd want, oh, I guess I have it here, something like this. So your variable name would be average CPV or something like that, equals, and then you want to use the .mean function on our CPV column to get a single value. All right, so you can replace, or I just have our placeholder number 1 there. You can replace that with our column using our .mean function. And once you have that and add our single value component, all right, when you add your single value component, you can set it to what it should point to. So the reason that we give our variable a name is then when we go to set up our single value, we can just point it directly at this value, give it a little title, give it a format. In this case, it's going to be a dollar amount. I would do currency. And when you refresh your code here, and then if you hit your little run button, it'll run anything downstream or anything that depends on this code. So when you run this, it'll run our little single value and it'll tell you what your new number is. Yeah. So we've calculated our CPV per each campaign, right? So we have a column that has our CPV per each campaign. So we want to get the average of that whole column. Yes. So we want to give it our whole column and then use our .mean function to get the average of that column. All right, so you should have a result that looks something like this, right? We're gonna grab that column from our data frame. So our campaigns 2 data frame is the one that has our CPV column, which I can double check in my little data browser. All right, I've got CPV here. So I'm gonna give my variable, I'm gonna do equals, so I'm doing an assignment. I'm giving it this column, and then I'm using my dot mean function to take the mean of that whole column. And then this, when I run this code, this little thing turns blue. That tells me that it's being saved as a variable I can refer to later. All right, and then in my single values, so if you've already got this component, you can click on the gear and see what it's being given. All right, so you can give it a value. In this case, I'm going to select my average CPV value from my list, give it this little title, give it my currency. We're not going to use this for today, but there's a cool feature where you can also do a comparison. So let's say you had calculated the average CPV this year and the average CPV last year. You could add a little comparison and it would show you kind of the plus or minus of how far off this one is from last year. So it can be good to show, like, are we doing more sales this quarter than last quarter? Like a fun little built-in type of thing. Okay, any questions about single values? All right. All right, cool. So last kind of type of component is our table type component. So we're going to use another type of cell, a table display. Again, this is very similar in other visualization software. So we're going to grab our table display, we're going to grab our total spend data frame, and we're going to apply a little bit of formatting. Okay. So to add my table display data frame, I do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to come in here and do add cell. Depending on how wide your screen is, it might be in the middle or it might be a little extra bit here. And you should get table as a display option. All right, so go ahead and do that. And then you want to give it our, our total spend data frame. So just this little tiny guy that has these 2 columns. All right, once you do that, this is where you want to select the data frame that you want it to display. All right, it's going to do this. And then you want to make sure you apply a little bit of formatting here. In particular, you want to make sure that our spent amount is showing up as dollars. To do that, I'm going to click on my column header and then format. All right, so just format as currency. There's some other formatting options stuff in here as well. So do format, and then you just want to grab currency. Okay. Any issues with table? This one's pretty simple. This one also has a good conditional formatting setup. So I think we talked about this in the Excel class, or if you've done this in Excel or Google Sheets, same thing. So if I had a larger table, it's often convenient to set like a red, yellow, green type of coloring. I can do that. It's got some built-in color scales for me that I can use. Probably the thing I would use more often if I had more rows. All right. Okay. We're plugging along. Okay, so far in our dashboard, just to look at where we're at so far, I'm going to switch over to my app view so I can get past all the code. So far, we've got a couple components put together. We've got our CPV by marketing campaigns. We've got a chart sorted, color-coded, using all our model data. Super cool. Then we've got our single value component, right? Our average CPV. I could imagine in my final dashboard design, I might want to put this somewhere near this overall chart so that I can get a sense for which of these campaigns is above or below my average, right? Obviously, you can, mentally make a guess at that because this is a small chart, but that's like a design thing I might want to consider. Okay. And then I've got my little table showing my total spent amount. This is a good example of a table you might want on a final dashboard because it's relatively small and straightforward as to what it is. You don't want to have a table with like 20 columns in your final dashboard because at that point you should either be selecting the most important column, you should be doing some summary, maybe presenting that information as a chart, right? So if you're going to use a table display, you want to keep it as simple as you can, and if it's much bigger than this, definitely recommend some conditional formatting or sorting in there. All right, so next thing that we are gonna do is add our recommended budget. Okay, so that is, the prompt for this project was to analyze our previous year's budget and then also make some recommendations based on that as to what our budget should be. Okay, so based on what we've looked at so far, our Facebook ads and our podcast channels have our lowest CPV and our highest ROAS. Okay, that's what we saw in our previous data. So we essentially want to reallocate. We're going to say Google ads and influencer marketing had a higher CPV. Those didn't perform as well for us this year. So we're going to take the budget that we previously spent on those. And for this upcoming year, we're going to move that budget to spend on Facebook and podcasts, right? So we want to do a couple things, all right? We want to take that total spend, divide it evenly, and then we're going to save it to a new variable, all right? Because we want to put together a data table that essentially presents our recommended budget. Okay, so here's what we're going to want to do. To figure out how much budget we want to allocate away from our lower performing channels to our higher performing channels, we're going to create this new variable called new budget to add. Okay. In order to do that, we're first going to create a bit of a filtered data frame, if you will, meaning I could do this in SQL as well, but meaning I'm going to take my total spend data frame. All right. And I'm going to filter it down. So I'm going to do is in, meaning I'm going to filter it by values in this vendor column, Google ads and influencer marketing. So I'm essentially just doing a very simple filter on my very simple data frame. Okay. I'm filtering for just the two pieces of budget that I want to, those are the two pieces of budget that I want to add up and then reallocate to my other channels. Right. That's what I'm trying to get. Okay. So I have a line of Python that does this. I could have done this in SQL as well. All right. So what you should do is take that and then write a line of code to get that total spend from this new filtered spend guy right here. Divide it by 2 and save that to our new variable, our new budget to add. Okay. So I'll pick over here. I have done our filtered spend line already, right? You can see that this looks exactly the same as our total spend data frame, just quite literally filtered down. All right, so then this is your task. So what you should do is take the sum of that column from our new data frame, divide it by 2 and save it to this variable because we're going to add this in our next step. Make sense? So what you need to do is add up this column and save that sum divided by 2 to this variable. Okay, so you should replace my little thing here.
Basically, the company is cutting the Facebook ads and podcast ads, and they want to, how to say, like, let and still keep the Google ads. And,
Other way around. So we're gonna, so we looked at the CPV before. Yeah, yep.
Are those two filtered out, are they like lower?
Yeah, so those were our
Lower
higher CPV or our
100%
lower return on ad spend. Yeah. Yep, exactly. Okay, cool. Okay. So the concept here is that last year we spent about $65,000 on Google ads, $17,000 on influencer ads, and they didn't perform super well. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna add those two up. So let's call that roughly, what is that, roughly $80,000? All right, we're gonna take that $80,000 and we're gonna say we're gonna spend roughly 40,000 more on our two channels that worked. We're gonna spend 40,000 more on podcasts. We're gonna spend 40,000 more on Facebook. Right, that's this number that we're trying to get to. So the way that I would do that, back over to my notebook view. All right, so I filtered down my data frame, then all I'm gonna do here is some math on my column. All right, so I'm gonna fill in for my new variable. I'm just gonna say, look at my new filtered spend data frame. Take our little spent amount column. I'm gonna use my dot sum function to take the total of that column. All right, very similar to the dot mean function we used before, my dot sum. And the only reason I'm dividing it by 2 is because I know I'm about to split this total $80,000-ish into my 2 other channels. I want to evenly split it into my 2 channels that are working. So this is the amount I want to add to each other channel. Okay, so you should get this 41,000-ish dollars. All right. Cool. Now the reason that we did all of that work is so that we can add our proposed budget to our data frame. So what we basically want to create is a little proposed budget to include in our final dashboard, meaning for each of our vendors, we have the total amount that was spent maybe last year, maybe 2023, you don't remember. We want to add a column that says, here's what we propose you do. And essentially what we're proposing that we do is that we zero out 2 of these lines and we allocate the rest of the budget, right? So 2 of these will be 0 when we're done with this, right? That's our recommendation. Our recommendation is that we stop spending money on Google ads because they didn't have a good CPV. We're going to stop spending money on influencer marketing because it didn't have a good CPV. We're going to take that money. And so in our recommended budget, our proposed budget is going to be 0 for Google. For Facebook, it's going to be this plus the 40,000 that we just figured out. For influencer, it's going to be 0. And for podcasts, it's going to be this plus the 40,000 that we just figured out. Make sense? That's the budget that we're recommending. All right, so we're going to use a case statement to create our proposed budget. All right. And we can refer to our variable. So the reason that we saved it as a Python variable, so you could imagine we could put in budget and we could just type in plus $40,000, right? That's something we could do. But we can actually refer to this variable by putting it in our double curly brackets. So when we add this into our SQL query, when we're doing essentially our new formula column here with our case statement, instead of saying plus 40,000, we can do plus curly brackets name of our variable, and that'll calculate, which is awesome because then if later we go and update it for some reason, we can just rerun our code and everything below it will update. And we won't have to go and re-type anything anywhere. Okay. So I should have a case statement here in as our proposed budget. Right. So this is one of these in parentheses case when something. Yes. Yes, case when vendor, right? When vendor equals influencer marketing and what is it? Google, I think. We want then proposed budget should be 0. So when vendor equals the or is in those things equals those things, then 0. Else we want to take the total spent, the spent amount, and we want to add this. We want to add our plus our new budget amount. Okay, so that's what our case statement should look like. Right?
The layer else, then why else?
Yeah, great question. So for example, let's go here. Fresh one. Okay. All right, great. So let's work on our case statement. Case when vendor equals influencer marketing, say, then 0. Okay. And then we could do, there's a few different ways I could do this, but I'll do this this way. Then when vendor equals, let's see, what was the other one we wanted to get rid of? Google Ads. Google Ads, then 0. And then I could do a couple things here. I could then say, when vendor equals podcast, do add our, where's my extra line? Add our new budget. When vendor equals Facebook ads, then add our budget. But those are the only other cases. So else just means if neither of these cases apply, do this. So I could spell out each individual case, or I could give it, just give it here. So then if I do this, then I would say, what was my spent amount column? Spent amount. And then I can add my plus, my double curly brackets, new budget to add. Right?
Special meaning about that double.
Yes, so the double curly brackets is going to tell my SQL query that this is a variable that I've saved, meaning this is a thing that I calculated in a previous cell and I saved it to this variable name. I gave it this name. Yeah, so anytime I'm referring back to a variable, it's going to be in our curly brackets. This, I think, is the first time we've done that.
So like, if I just get rid of the double, it would just.
It's just going to give you an error because it doesn't know to go look for a variable in another cell unless you give it the curly brackets. If that's not a place it's normally going to look unless you especially let it know to do that. All right. All right, now there's a few different ways I could write this. Here's a very similar way that I wrote this as my little demo. So in my when, I could just do this with one when, and I could have my when statement be when vendor equals Facebook ads or when vendor equals podcast, right? I could use my and or logic there. So in this case, I said for these two that I want to add the budget to, then do my spent amount plus my variable, so doing my curly brackets, else 0. So if it's not one of these cases, then 0 end. So kind of a flip of what I did before. And the only other change is that I changed this into one when statement instead of 2. Doesn't matter, just kind of a style choice. Whatever you think will be easier to read or for someone else to understand is usually the best fit. Okay. All right, so once I have that, then I also have this column here, which is my percent change column. All right, so that is intended to show me how much, what percent change is this budget from last year's budget. So in this case, my budget that I moved to $0 is negative 100%. That was my percent, my budget changed to 0. Right, so 100% of the budget I spent last year, I'm not spending this year. Right, so percent, that's this column that was already in here is percent change. As an example. All right, okay. Great. So then for this, I'm going to do a little table display, right? Yeah. Right, okay. So this is my little table display, right? If this is my proposed budget data frame, then I can feed this into my little table display cell. This is maybe a case where I want to use my conditional formatting, which is what I have here. If I click on this column, and then I do go down to my column settings, conditional formatting. All right. I basically gave it some conditions. I said if it's greater than 0, make it green, otherwise make it red. All right, I could do more complicated logic if I wanted to there. And then I should get something like this. All right. Cool. So I can see here, for example, my Facebook ads, the green gives me a good, just like quick visual cue of this. Last year we spent $38,000. This year we're going to spend almost $80,000 because it worked so well. So it's 108% increase in my budget. Right, meaning I'm spending my whole budget plus 8% again, or my whole budget again plus an additional 8%. All right, cool. Any questions about our variable, adding our case statement, getting to our proposed budget? Yeah.
Can we go back to the first SQL?
Yeah.
That we wrote? I'm just trying to see.
Yeah, which one?
Like the when we're selecting case 1 vendor equal to influencer marketing.
Oh, yes, this one over here. Yes, this guy.
So we don't need a comma right after the first one,
Correct. Yeah, you don't need a comma between these. Yep.
because I'm trying to see what's going on with
You got
it.
an error?
Yeah,
You want help?
yeah, sure.
Okay, what you got?
So now I know that it's happening here. Awesome.
Cool.
I think this should be able to work. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, great. All right. Well done. Okay, cool. All right. Any other issues, errors? This one? Yeah. You got an error? What you got?
And it's like near comma.
All right. Oh, because you don't need a comma after your parentheses here.
Okay.
Because that's still the same. You're giving it that whole thing, you're giving them the name as proposed budget. So you don't need a comma within the column itself. That fix it? Sweet. Okay, cool. All right.
Also,
One more.
another arrow near.
Okay.
Other commas in there. Oh, at or near the parentheses, it looks like. Okay, why is that on?
Oh, L0 end. You need end at the end of your. If you look at my case statement up here. And you always need the word end, which I realize is a little redundant. But that should do it.
So the end should add whenever we try to make the equation. Or-
Just with this case statement. So the way that the case statement works is it always needs to start with case, end with end,
Oh,
and then you can have however many when then combos. You can have an else. You definitely need the case and the end, otherwise it's not gonna work. That fixes it. Sweet. Okay, cool. All right. So last thing to get to is creating a chart for the ROAS. All right, that's kind of the last chunk I had in here, which was to sort of show you the interactive component. We've got a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to kind of show you what this looks like. But basically what you want to know is that for adding interactive components, we have another cell type that we haven't talked about yet. So you go into your add cell, you look here, you have a couple of different options for cells that you can bring into your, or different options for input cells that you can put into your dashboard. A common one to go with is drop down or multi-select, drop down just being a single select, multi-select being multi-select. So I could bring this in here. When you have an input, same thing as with our charts and our single value, you're going to kind of point it at what you want it to point at. All right, so I could say, I'm just going to do a simpler example for the sake of time. I'm going to say select a vendor. There's a more detailed example in the doc you could look at later. But if I wanted to say select a vendor, I could either type in some vendors. That's what static means. I could say this vendor, Google, you know, I could type in my own options, which would be the options in the dropdown, or what I use most of the time is to go to dynamic and then choose an input from one of my data frames that I already have. So for example, here, I'm going to go to my proposed budget data set somewhere. And I guess we can just do my vendor one. All right, so I can pick whatever data frame I want and then whichever column I want to be my input option. So if I'm going to select this one, say I'll grab my join data set, grab my vendor. Then it's going to go look at my join data set and grab all the unique values in my vendor column and give those to me as input options. So I could select Google, I could select influencer marketing, etc. All right, and then the very last thing that I can do is create a SQL cell that's gonna use those squiggly brackets again. So anything that I've selected in my input cell is getting saved to this little special variable, select a vendor. All right, I'm not gonna go through this part in full detail just for the sake of time, but you can read how this works. But the concept is whatever values I select get saved to this variable. And then I can write a query like this one. Select star from table where, in this case, vendor equals. And then I can do my squiggly brackets and refer to that variable from my input cell. All right, meaning anytime I change my input cell, the below will change. All right. So I'll do a very quick example of this. So I have my little input cell. Do a select smart vendor is in select a vendor. Okay, all right, so I've got my little interactive component. I've got my SQL query where I'm using my where statement is referring back to this variable, right? So it's saying where vendor is in the select a vendor array, meaning this anything I've selected here. So if I change this, so watch the bottom data table. If I change my input and say I add Facebook ads, you'll see that this added this. As soon as it reruns, it's added Facebook ads here. I can come up and remove, say, influencer marketing as soon as the data refreshes, which will take a second. So I get rid of this extra cell thing I just clicked on. Then influencer marketing goes away, right? So this is how I'm creating a reactive component. And furthermore, where we layer this all together, I can take this data frame, which is based on my query, which is reacting to my input, and I can make a chart based on it. Right, so let's say I'm going to make the world's simplest chart in our last moment here, which is just going to be, we'll do a little stacked bar, which is just spend by vendor. Right, I've got my little chart. So then what I can do is change. So here you see I've got a bar for Facebook and Google. Let's say I want to change this and I want to see influencer and podcasts. Come back down here and my chart's updating because my chart is pulling from this data frame. And this query is referring to my input. So when I put all of these on my final app mode, so this little quilt icon can put them in your app builder, I don't have to put this query in there. Nobody who's looking at my final dashboard has to know about that query. All right, but when I add these to my app builder, I can go to app mode. It's looking a little cleaner. All right, and then I've got this nice little kind of display, right? I can drag and drop these. Maybe I want to put them next to each other. All right, and now I can do something like, all right, scoot this over, and maybe I want to remove my Facebook ads. It'll update, and this will update automatically, so I'm making a cool interactive.
Can anyone without a cell phone?
Yep, so when you do share, so you would need to publish this. So first you would publish and just it'll let it run, and then it'll check for any errors, and then it'll let you publish. And then you can share. So you can share based on anyone in this group, anyone who has the link. You can share with specific people's emails if you want to. Yeah, so this is pretty cool. So this is how I make all my dashboards at work, because I do all the SQL. Nobody else ever sees like this whole thing with all my queries and stuff. I only share my kind of published final app view with them, which has all like any nice little formatting I did, stuff like that.
So it's like they're downloading an app.
Yeah,
instead
basically,
of
or
just
you,
a chart.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so they see the whole thing, and you can pick like, so all this little text, like all the instructions I wrote for you guys, I added these to my app, but I could remove these if I wanted. Like, let's say I didn't want my end user to see this, I could just remove it. It's still there for me, but it's not in my little final view. So from either view, I can come in and just do this little quilt icon, that'll add or remove anything. Cool. All right, that takes us right to the end of time. I got a little bit more detail about kind of doing the refreshes, published stuff that you were just talking about in the slides, so those will get posted. You should have access to your account on our Hex professional plan, I believe for the rest of, or for the next year. The Hex folks were very nice to give it to us for free. So you feel free to use it. You can create your own documents. You can upload your own files if you want to kind of practice or you have other data you want to work with from a class or anything. The learn.hex.tech, the kind of learning part of their website, has a bunch of good tutorials that I've recommended before. Happy to make other recommendations if there's stuff you want to learn about. If you haven't already, I'm happy to keep in touch. You can look me up on LinkedIn. That's all I got.
Refresh memory of the recommendation. Learning material.
Yes, I can. Let me I have them in a previous week's thing. Let me throw that up here.